This chart tracks two vital metrics in the Canadian economy. The bottom line shows a nation with the lowest per capita productivity growth in the G20. The top line traces household debt-to-income ratios that have now eclipsed the levels seen right before the 2008 U.S. housing crash. For the millennial cohort, the modern social contract is represented by properties like this: a rotting single-story brick bungalow, originally purchased for $50,000 in 1982, backing onto a highway, now lists for well over $1 million. Official narratives from Ottawa attribute this fracture to global economic headwinds, or the growing pains of a modern post-national state. However, the data reveals a divergence that began decades before the current global crisis. This economic trajectory aligns with a sequence of structural shifts within the Canadian state. Over 5 decades, a cohort known as the Laurentian elite has reshaped the nation's political culture to serve their own ideological survival. This decline represents the execution of a generational debt transfer, meticulously disguised as a progressive utopia. The modern Canadian state was engineered by a cadre of intellectuals detached from the traditional Westminster system. Pierre Trudeau's political education was forged here, at the London School of Economics, under Marxist theoretician Harold Lasky, and refined through his travels to Maoist China. In the 1950s, Trudeau and his circle at the journal Cité Libre identified the Anglo-commercial dominance of Montreal as a bourgeois hegemony that had to be dismantled. While radical separatists chose terrorism, Trudeau chose Gramscian counter-hegemony. He realized that by imposing a centralized, charter-based order, the federal state itself could neutralize the demographic weight of the English-speaking majority. To execute this capture, the Laurentian elite needed a vulnerable demographic. They found it in the boomer generation. Watching the technicolor spectacle of the 1967 California counterculture from the snows of the Dominion, Canadian youth craved spiritual validation and a way to shed the boring realities of economics. The elite fed this vanity. When Pierre Trudeau, a 51-year-old minister of justice, met an 18-year-old high school graduate in Tahiti, gave her a job in the Prime Minister's office, and secretly married her, the electorate did not recoil. They cheered a wealthy patriarch's abuse of office power as proof of his modernity. For this demographic, culture was something consumed to prove one's virtue. They were so eager to reject the authority of their parents that they willingly surrendered their political agency to figures who flattered their sense of novelty. This political capture relied on a specific tactical methodology, weaponizing moral posturing to conceal material weakness. In 1970, the U.S. tanker SS Manhattan transited the Northwest Passage, challenging Canadian sovereignty. Canada possessed the sheer naval and logistical inability to interdict the vessel. Unable to project military force, Trudeau flanked the Americans with environmentalism. He drafted the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, asserting jurisdiction via pollution regulations that cost nothing to declare. He successfully rebranded logistical impotence as cost-free environmental leadership. A year later, the 1971 multiculturalism policy was introduced as the next tactical weapon. Designed to atomize the population, the policy officially redefined Canada as a mosaic of fragmented microidentities, effectively freezing the historic core of English Canada in a state of political incapacity. The cultural establishment enforced this erasure through willful blindness. For 50 years, they venerated figures like Buffy Sainte Marie as a spiritual vessel of Indigenous wisdom, ignoring archives and family letters, proving she was born Beverly Jean Santa Maria in Massachusetts. The comfortable lie allowed the elite to purchase unearned moral superiority over the working class. Meanwhile, the state actively ignored the foundational history of the United Empire Loyalists. These were refugees of terror who fled into the wilderness, paying for their loyalty during the hungry year of 1788 by boiling elm bark and digging for toxic roots to survive the winter. Prioritizing progressive utopian aesthetics over harsh historical realities successfully allowed the state to erase the nation's core founding identity. Decades later, the electorate's visceral hatred for Stephen Harper validated this psychology. They rejected him not for economic failure, but because his fiscal prudence reminded them of their boring parents. He demanded the bills be paid, reminding them of reality. The 2013 coronation of Justin Trudeau allowed an aging demographic to psychically relive their youth. They ignored both verifiable economic decline and personal scandals, including the 2000 Kokanee Summit incident, which the Prime Minister dismissed with the patrician defense that he wouldn't have been so forward if he knew she reported for a national paper. As the economic ruin deepens, Mark Carney emerges as the ultimate enabler. A Goldman Sachs banker with imperial validation from the City of London, he uses concepts like climate finance to resolve the elite's cognitive dissonance, bridging the gap between ruthless global capital and liberal virtue. Facing the collapse of their productivity model, this elite is now executing a retreat into a stagnant, heavily regulated European economic sphere. By framing American competitiveness as a vulgar dystopia, they disguise their own nation's impoverishment as a position of ethical superiority. The federal government has ceased to function as a neutral arbiter of commerce. It is now a closed-loop wealth transfer engine for a bilingual bureaucracy. Mandatory bilingualism for federal vendors acts as an ethnic filter, while state-sponsored Quebec-based firms like SNC-Lavalin capture high-margin contracts despite catastrophic records of technical failure. This map of Eastern Canada illustrates the actual distribution of the nation's people. The vast majority of the tax-paying industrial workforce lives right here, packed into the Golden Horseshoe. However, the high-frequency rail project ignores these population centers. The route connects Ottawa to Quebec City, functioning as a taxpayer-funded commuter line for the administrative oligarchy to travel between their offices and their ancestral homes, while the working class remains gridlocked. This brings us back to the $1.3 million starter home. Statistics Canada data reveals that 34% of Canadian retirees have no investment savings. Their perceived wealth is a hallucination, fueled by home equity lines of credit. They are effectively eating the house. This valuation is the result of a coordinated racket. Corrupt provincial governments, lobbied by developer interests, artificially restricted land supply to maximize yield, creating a pressure cooker of scarcity in the second-largest country on Earth. When retirees attempt to liquidate these inflated assets, they will find a millennial generation stripped of capital. The wealth will evaporate in a liquidity trap. Millennials face a massive generational debt transfer, the final bill for a cycle of planned cultural extinction. The boomer generation, having leveraged their children's future to finance their own present, leaves behind a legacy of debt and an administrative state that demands total compliance from the very people it has impoverished.